Before tonight's journey begins, let me know where you're listening from. Now, settle in, let your shoulders soften, let your breathing slow, and allow the day to drift quietly away. Tonight we travel to the Suffolk countryside in December of 1908, to the walled kitchen garden of Swanton Morley Hall, where the frost lies thick upon the glass of a long, low greenhouse, and the air inside smells of damp earth, geranium leaves, and the faint, sweet ghost of ripening tomatoes. Among them is Arthur Finch, a 53-year-old head gardener, carrying one well-worn trowel with a rosewood handle, one leather-bound notebook filled with 30 years of observations on the weather, and a grief that has settled into his bones like a winter chill that cannot be dispelled by any fire. He expects only another night of lying awake in his cottage, listening to the grandfather clock in the hall strike every quarter hour until dawn. But tonight, when the frost promises to be the hardest of the season, he will make his way to the greenhouse at 3 in the morning to tend the stoves, and there he will find a presence he has not met before. This is the story of Arthur Finch, and of one winter night, when a man who had forgotten how to rest discovers that the heart, like the earth, must sometimes lie fallow before it can bear again. So close your eyes, breathe gently, and let the creaking of frost-laden glass and the whisper of steam from the boiler carry you through darkness and sleep. The day had been a gray one, the kind of December afternoon that seemed to begin at noon and dissolve directly into twilight without any proper interval of daylight. Arthur Finch had spent it in the potting shed, sorting through the season's last dahlia tubers, feeling their dry, papery skins between his fingers, checking each one for rot or softness, and dusting them with sulfur before laying them in trays of sand for the winter. The work was methodical, soothing, and it occupied his hands while his mind wandered the same worn paths it had walked for the past 3 years, since the pneumonia had taken Eleanor in the spring of 1905. He had not expected her to die. That was the thing that came back to him most often, in the small hours, when the silence of the cottage pressed in around him like a weight. She had been only 47, strong and capable, with a laugh that could fill a room, and hands that coaxed life from the most stubborn soil. She had been his wife for 26 years, and she had been the one who understood that his silences were not coldness, but a different kind of language, one that spoke in the curl of a fern frond and the angle of the sun across the vegetable beds. When she had gone, the language had gone with her, and Arthur had found himself stranded in a country where no one spoke his tongue. He set the last tuber in its tray and wiped his hands on his canvas apron. Through the window of the potting shed, he could see the long, low shape of the greenhouse, its glass roof catching the last of the light and turning it to a pale, watery gray. The boiler would need to be stoked again before he went to bed. The forecast had promised a sharp frost, the kind that could blacken the tender pelargoniums and fuchsias if the temperature in the greenhouse dipped below 40 degrees. He had been tending these stoves for 30 years, and he had never lost a plant to frost, not one. The duty was a point of pride, a thread of continuity in a life that had otherwise been severed. He walked across the yard, his boots crunching on the gravel, and pushed open the door of the greenhouse. The warmth hit him first, a blanket of humid air that smelled of wet earth, leaf mold, and the faint, sharp scent of geraniums. The staging on either side of the central path was crowded with pots. The pelargoniums, their leaves soft and velvety, their flowers a brave, defiant pink. The fuchsias, their delicate bells hanging like tiny dancers suspended in mid-motion. The cuttings of lavender and rosemary that had been taken in the autumn, now rooted and pushing out new growth. Arthur moved along the path, his hand brushing the leaves as he passed, a greeting he had performed 10,000 times and would perform 10,000 more. He checked the thermometer that hung near the door, 52 degrees. The boiler was doing its work, but the night would be long, and the cold would press against the glass like a living thing. seeking every crack, every gap, every weakness. He filled the stoker's hob with coal from the bunker, opened the iron door of the boiler, and fed the fire with careful, measured shovelfuls. The flames licked at the new fuel, and the boiler gave a low, contented sigh, like a sleeping animal turning over in its dreams. When he was satisfied, he closed the door and stood for a moment in the warm, dim light. The last of the day had drained from the sky, and the glass above him was now a deep, bruised purple, with the first stars beginning to prick through. He thought of Eleanor, as he always did at this hour, and he felt the familiar ache rise in his chest, a dull, persistent pain that had become as much a part of him as his own heartbeat. He would go home, eat a slice of cold meat pie, drink a cup of tea, and lie down in the bed that was too wide for one man. He would watch the shadow of the wardrobe shift across the ceiling, and he would count the hours until the clock struck 3, when he would rise again and make his way back to the greenhouse. It was a routine that had sustained him for 3 years, and it had become his shape of the world, the work, the silence, the long nights, the frost. He did not know that tonight the frost would bring something else. The cottage that Arthur Finch had shared with Eleanor stood at the edge of the estate, a low building of Suffolk red brick, with a roof of dark pantiles and a chimney that smoked steadily through the winter months. It had been the head gardener's cottage for as long as anyone could remember, and Arthur had lived in it for 31 years, ever since he had been appointed as a young man of 22, fresh from his apprenticeship at the Royal Horticultural Society's gardens at Chiswick. He had arrived with a single trunk, a set of pruning shears, and the conviction that he would spend his life among plants and be content. He had not anticipated Eleanor, and he had not anticipated the way her presence would transform the cottage from a shelter into a home. Now, as he let himself in through the back door, the silence of the cottage struck him with the same force it had struck him every evening for 3 years. It was not a mere absence of sound. It was a presence, a negative shape that had been carved out of the space where Eleanor's voice, her footsteps, her humming, her laughter had once lived. The kettle on the hob was cold. The fire in the grate had burned down to a heap of white ash. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked with a deliberate, unhurried rhythm, as if it had all the time in the world and did not care that Arthur had none. He lit the lamp, its yellow glow pushing back the darkness in a small circle around the kitchen table, and he set about the business of his evening meal. He was not a man who took pleasure in cooking, but he was a man who took pleasure in order, and the preparation of food was a task that could be approached with the same methodical precision he brought to the potting shed. He sliced the cold pie with a knife that had been sharpened so often that the blade was a thin, curved crescent of steel. He laid the slices on a plate, added a spoonful of pickled onions from a jar, and carried the plate to the table. He ate without tasting, his gaze fixed on the window, where the frost had begun to form in delicate, fern-like patterns on the glass. The pie was followed by a cup of tea, brewed strong and dark, the way Eleanor had always made it. He had tried to change the habit, to drink it weaker, to add sugar, to do something that would break the connection, but he had found that he could not. The tea was a ritual, and rituals were the only things that held him together. He washed the plate and the cup, dried them, and put them away in the cupboard. He wound the clock. He banked the fire. He climbed the stairs to the bedroom, his feet heavy on the creaking treads, and he began the slow, familiar process of trying to sleep. The bedroom was a small room with a low ceiling and a single window that looked out over the garden. The bed was a brass-framed affair that had been in the cottage when he arrived, and he had never thought to replace it. It was a good bed, solid and comfortable, but it was too large for one person, and the space beside him was a constant, aching reminder of what he had lost. He lay on his back, his hands folded across his chest, and he stared at the ceiling, where the shadows of the bare branches outside the window moved in the lamplight, like the fingers of a hand reaching for something just out of reach. The clock in the hall struck 9, then past, then 10. He closed his eyes and tried to will himself into sleep, but his mind would not be still. It circled, like a dog that could not find a comfortable place to lie down, returning again and again to the same thoughts: the greenhouse, the frost, the boiler, the plants that depended on him, the cold that would press against the glass until dawn. He had checked the thermometer twice before leaving. He had filled the hopper. The fire was good. There was nothing to worry about. And yet, the worry was there, as constant as his own heartbeat, a low, thrumming anxiety that had become the background music of his life. He had not always been like this. Before Eleanor's death, he had slept the sleep of the just, deep and untroubled, rising at dawn with the energy of a man who had been restored by the night. The bed had been a place of warmth and closeness, of whispered conversations in the dark, of Eleanor's hand resting on his chest, her breath slow and even against his shoulder. Now, the bed was a place of exile, and the night was a landscape he had to cross alone, hour by hour, until the blessed relief of morning. At 11, he heard the clock strike, and he made a decision. He would not lie here, tossing and turning, waiting for the alarm to summon him at 3. He would go to the greenhouse now, stoke the fire again, and sit in the warmth until the dawn came. It was a foolish plan, perhaps, but it was better than this slow, suffocating wakefulness. He rose, pulled on his heavy coat and his scarf, and lit the lantern. He let himself out of the cottage, and the cold hit him like a physical blow, sharp and clean, and shockingly alive after the stale air of the bedroom. The path to the greenhouse was a ribbon of white in the darkness, the gravel crunching under his boots with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the stillness of the night. The frost was already thick on the grass, a silver fur that glittered in the light of the lantern. The air smelled of coal smoke and cold earth, and the distant salty tang of the North Sea, which lay some 20 miles to the east. Above him, the sky was a field of stars, scattered across the black velvet of the heavens, like seeds thrown by an invisible hand. The moon was a thin crescent, low on the horizon, and it gave almost no light. The greenhouse rose out of the darkness ahead of him, a long, low shape that seemed to glow from within, with a faint, warm light. The boiler was still burning. He could see the flicker of the fire through the grate, and the glass of the roof was covered in a thick layer of frost that sparkled in the lantern light like 1,000 tiny diamonds. He pushed open the door, and the warmth wrapped around him like a blanket, and he stepped inside, into the quiet, humid world of the plants, where the air was thick with the smell of earth and the promise of life. Arthur Finch had been a gardener for 41 years, and the profession had shaped him as surely as the frost shapes the landscape. He had begun as a boy of 12, working in the kitchen gardens of a small estate in Norfolk, where the head gardener had been a man of few words and high standards, a man who had taught him that the first duty of a gardener was observation. "You must watch," the old man had said, his voice rough as gravel. "You must watch the soil, the sky, the leaves, the stems. You must watch the way the light falls and the way the wind moves. The plants will tell you what they need, but only if you are paying attention." Arthur had paid attention. He had learned to read the signs, the subtle yellowing of a leaf that indicated a nitrogen deficiency, the way a stem would bend toward the light, the particular stillness of the air that preceded a frost. He had learned the names of plants, their Latin names and their common names, their habits and their preferences, their weaknesses and their strengths. He had learned that a garden was not a collection of individual plants, but a community, a web of relationships that shifted and changed with the seasons. and that the gardener's role was not to impose his will upon this community, but to guide it, to nurture it, to create the conditions in which it could flourish. His own garden, the walled kitchen garden of Swanton Morley Hall, was a masterpiece of order and abundance. It was a rectangle of land, some 2 acres in extent, enclosed by high brick walls that absorbed the heat of the sun and radiated it back into the soil, extending the growing season by several weeks on either side. The walls were lined with espaliered fruit trees, pears, apples, plums, trained into elegant, symmetrical patterns that were both beautiful and productive. The beds were laid out in precise rows, with gravel paths between them, and each bed was dedicated to a particular crop: the peas and beans, the brassicas, the root vegetables, the salads, the herbs. At the center of the garden, there was a sundial, set on a stone plinth, and around it, a circular bed of lavender, which in summer was a haze of purple and a hum of bees. But the heart of the garden, the place where Arthur spent the most time and the most care, was the greenhouse. It was a long, low structure, built of brick and glass, with a pitched roof that faced south to catch the maximum light. It was divided into 3 sections: the stove house, where the boiler lived and where the most tender plants were kept; the intermediate house, where the temperature was moderated for the fuchsias and pelargoniums; and the cool house, where the hardier plants spent the winter in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the spring. The boiler was a magnificent piece of engineering, a cast-iron behemoth that had been installed in 1875 and had been burning coal ever since, with only the occasional replacement of a pipe or a valve. It was a fire-tube boiler, which meant that the hot gases from the fire passed through a series of tubes that were surrounded by water, heating the water and producing steam that was then circulated through iron pipes that ran the length of the greenhouse. The system was simple, robust, and effective, and Arthur had learned to read its moods as surely as he read the moods of the plants. He knew when the fire needed to be fed, when the dampers needed to be adjusted, when the pressure needed to be released. He knew the sounds of the boiler, the hiss of the steam, the clank of the pipes, the low, steady rumble of the fire, and he found them comforting, a kind of music that accompanied his solitary hours. That night, as he sat on a wooden stool near the boiler, with the lantern casting a pool of yellow light around him, he fell into the familiar rhythm of the greenhouse routine. He checked the thermometer, which read 48 degrees. He opened the door of the boiler and looked at the fire, a bed of glowing coals with a few flames still dancing among them. He added a shovelful of coal, not too much, just enough to keep the fire steady until the next check. He closed the door and listened to the hiss of the steam, the clank of the pipes, the soft, steady breathing of the boiler. Then he began to walk the length of the greenhouse, checking each plant as he passed. He touched the soil in the pots, feeling for moisture. He examined the leaves for signs of pest or disease. He turned the pots that were closest to the glass so that the plants would grow straight and not lean toward the light. He deadheaded a few fading flowers, his fingers working with the automatic precision of long practice. He talked to the plants, as he always did, a low, murmuring monologue that was half observation and half affection. "Good girl," he said to a particularly fine pelargonium, its leaves a deep, velvety green. "You're doing well. The frost won't get you tonight." It was the same routine he had followed every night of the winter, and it was the same routine he had followed every winter for the past 30 years. It was a routine that had been disrupted only once, in the winter of 1905, when Eleanor had been ill and he had stayed by her bedside, leaving the greenhouse in the care of his under-gardener, a young man named Thomas, who had been capable but not meticulous. The boiler had failed on the coldest night of the year, and he had lost a dozen plants, the first he had ever lost to frost. He had not blamed Thomas, not really, But the loss had felt like a betrayal, a crack in the edifice of his competence, and he had never allowed anyone else to tend the stove since. The clock in the hall of the big house struck midnight, the sound carrying across the frozen garden, muffled by the frost. Arthur settled himself on the stool, his back against the warm brick of the boiler house, and he let his eyes drift closed. He would not sleep, he told himself. He would simply rest, listen to the sounds of the greenhouse, wait for the dawn. But the warmth of the boiler, the steady rhythm of the steam, the familiar smells of earth and coal and geraniums began to work upon him, and his eyelids grew heavy, and the world began to soften at the edges. The clock struck 1, and Arthur stirred, his eyes opening to the dim, warm light of the greenhouse. He had not been asleep, exactly, but he had been in a state of deep, drifting rest, a kind of waking dream in which the boundaries between himself and the world around him had become blurred. He had been aware of the hiss of the steam, the creak of the glass as the frost tightened its grip, the soft, rhythmic drip of condensation from the roof. He had been aware of the plants, their presence, a quiet, green hum at the edge of his consciousness. And he had been aware of the absence, the vast, empty space where Eleanor's presence had once been, a hole in the fabric of his life that he could not mend. He stretched, his joints creaking, and stood up. The boiler was still burning steadily, the fire a warm orange glow behind the iron grate. He checked the thermometer. 46 degrees. The temperature was dropping, but slowly, and the boiler was keeping pace. He added another shovelful of coal, adjusted the damper slightly, and then decided to walk the length of the greenhouse again, to check on the plants, to reassure himself that everything was as it should be. The greenhouse was a world unto itself, a capsule of warmth and life in the frozen darkness of the winter night. The glass roof was covered in a thick layer of frost, so thick that it seemed almost opaque, and the moonlight that filtered through was a soft, diffuse glow, like light seen through water. The air was heavy with moisture, and the smell of damp earth and green leaves was thick and rich, a smell that spoke of growth and possibility, of the promise of spring that lay hidden beneath the surface of the winter. He moved along the central path, his footsteps silent on the gravel. The plants on either side of him seemed to have settled into their own version of sleep, their leaves still, their stems relaxed, their colors muted in the dim light. The pelargoniums had closed their flowers for the night, the petals folding in on themselves like tiny sleeping hands. The fuchsias hung their heads, their delicate bells still and silent. The cuttings of lavender and rosemary stood upright, their leaves dark and glossy, their scent a faint, clean whisper in the air. He reached the end of the greenhouse, where the cool house began, and he paused at the door. The cool house was the section where the hardier plants spent the winter, and it was not heated, the temperature allowed to drop to just above freezing. He opened the door and stepped inside, and the cold hit him, a sharp, clean contrast to the warmth of the stovehouse. The air here was dry and still, and the plants stood in rows, their leaves dormant, their roots resting in the cold soil, waiting for the warmth of the spring to call them back to life. Among them, in a corner near the wall, was a plant that Arthur had been tending for 30 years, a plant that had been given to him by Eleanor on the day they had moved into the cottage. It was a myrtle, a small, shrubby plant with dark, glossy leaves and a delicate, woody stem. It had been a gift of love, a symbol of the enduring nature of their bond, and it had thrived under his care, growing slowly but steadily, year after year, until it was now a small tree, some 4 feet tall, with a trunk that had thickened and gnarled with age. He had not told anyone about the myrtle. It was a secret, a private thing, a connection to Eleanor that he kept for himself, in the quiet, cold corner of the cool house, where no one else ever went. He touched its leaves, their surface cool and smooth under his fingers, and he felt the familiar ache rise in his chest, the grief that was always there, just below the surface, waiting to be triggered by a memory, a smell, a touch. "I miss you," he said, the words a whisper in the cold, still air. "I miss you every day." He stood there for a long moment, his hand resting on the myrtle's leaves, and then he turned and walked back to the stovehouse, where the warmth of the boiler waited for him. He sat down on the stool, and he let the warmth seep into his bones, and he closed his eyes, and he let the grief wash over him, a tide that he had learned to ride, a tide that he knew would never recede. The clock struck 1:30, and the greenhouse settled into its quiet, steady rhythm. The boiler hummed, the pipes clanked, the frost crept across the glass, thicker and thicker, sealing the greenhouse in a cocoon of ice. And Arthur Finch, the head gardener of Swanton Morley Hall, sat in the warmth, waiting for the dawn, waiting for the night to end, waiting for the long, slow passage of time that he had come to know as his life. The clock struck 2, and Arthur opened his eyes. He had not intended to sleep, but he had drifted again, his mind slipping into a state of half-awareness that was not quite rest and not quite wakefulness. He felt a stiffness in his neck, a dryness in his mouth, and he stretched, his arms reaching above his head, his spine cracking in a series of small, satisfying pops. The boiler was still burning, but the fire had died down a little, and the temperature in the greenhouse had dropped to 44 degrees. He added another shovelful of coal, opened the damper a little wider, and listened to the fire as it caught the new fuel, the flames licking up around the fresh black lumps, the heat beginning to build again. He was about to sit down again when he heard something, a sound that did not belong to the familiar chorus of the greenhouse. It was a sound from outside, a sound that was muffled by the frost and the glass, but unmistakable nonetheless. It was the sound of footsteps on the gravel path, slow and deliberate, crunching through the frost. Arthur's heart quickened. It was after 2 in the morning, on the coldest night of the year. No one should be out here. The estate was locked up, the servants in their beds, the family in the big house, warm and safe behind closed curtains. He had not told anyone that he was coming to the greenhouse. He had not told anyone that he would be here all night. And yet, someone was approaching, their footsteps steady and unhurried, as if they had every right to be here. He stood up, his hand moving instinctively to the trowel that hung from his belt, a tool that was more habit than weapon. He moved to the door of the greenhouse, his footsteps silent on the gravel, and he peered through the frost-covered glass. The figure was a silhouette, dark against the white of the frost, and it was moving with a slow, deliberate purpose, as if it knew exactly where it was going. It was a tall figure, wrapped in a long coat, with a hat pulled low, and it carried something in its hand, a lantern or a bag. Arthur could not tell. The figure stopped at the door of the greenhouse, and Arthur stepped back, his heart pounding. The door opened, and the figure stepped inside, bringing with it a gust of cold air that smelled of frost and coal smoke and something else, something that Arthur could not quite identify. The figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the frost-lit night, and then it reached up and pushed back its hat, revealing a face that was lined and weathered, a face that was both familiar and strange. It was a woman. She was old, perhaps 70 or more, with silver hair that was pulled back into a tight bun, and eyes that were the color of winter sky, a pale, clear blue that seemed to see everything and judge nothing. She wore a long coat of dark wool, and she carried a lantern in one hand, and in the other, a small, cloth-wrapped bundle that she held close to her chest. "Good evening," she said, her voice low and calm, like the sound of water moving over stones. "I hope I am not disturbing you." Arthur found his voice. "No," he said, his voice rough with surprise. "No, you are not disturbing me. But I must ask, who are you, and what are you doing here at this hour?" The woman smiled, a small, quiet smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "My name is Martha," she said, "Martha Green. I am the widow of the previous head gardener, Samuel Green. I lived in the cottage before you, some 50 years ago, and I have returned to say goodbye." Arthur stared at her, his mind struggling to process what she had said. The previous head gardener. He had heard the name, of course, from the old records, from the stories that the older servants told. Samuel Green had been a legendary figure, a man who had transformed the gardens of Swanton Morley Hall into a place of beauty and abundance, a man who had been loved and respected by all who knew him. He had died in 1878, and his wife had left the estate soon after, moving to somewhere in the north to live with her daughter. No one had heard from her since. "I don't understand," Arthur said. "Why are you here? Why tonight?" Martha Green stepped further into the greenhouse, her lantern casting a warm, golden light across the staging, the pots, the plants. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace, her eyes taking in everything: the pelargoniums, the fuchsias, the cuttings of lavender and rosemary, the boiler, the pipes, the frost on the glass. She seemed to be seeing the greenhouse not as it was, but as it had been, as it was in her memory, a place of warmth and life and love. "I have been away for a long time," she said, her voice soft, almost a whisper. "I have been living in Yorkshire, with my daughter and her family. It is a good life, a peaceful life, but I have never forgotten this place. I have never forgotten the greenhouse. It was my home for 40 years, and it was the place where I was happiest." She stopped at the door of the cool house, and she looked inside, her gaze resting on the rows of dormant plants, the cold, still air. "Samuel loved this greenhouse," she said. "He loved it more than anything, I think, except for me. He spent every hour he could here, tending the plants, checking the boiler, talking to the flowers. He said that the plants talked back to him, that they told him what they needed, and he listened. He was a good listener, my Samuel." Arthur felt a strange, uncomfortable feeling in his chest, a mixture of recognition and unease. He had felt the same way about Eleanor, that she had listened to him in a way that no one else ever had, that she had understood the language of his silence, the language of the garden. He had not realized that he had been looking for that same understanding, that same connection, in the years since her death. "Please," he said, his voice softer now, "please, sit down. Let me make you a cup of tea. There is a kettle on the stove, and I have some tea leaves in my pocket." Martha Green smiled, and this time, the smile reached her eyes, crinkling the corners in a way that made her look younger, more alive. "That would be very kind," she said. "I would like that very much." They sat on the 2 wooden stools near the boiler, the lantern between them, and Arthur poured the hot water over the tea leaves in the old enamel pot that he kept in the greenhouse for just such occasions. The smell of the tea, strong and dark, mixed with the smell of the coal smoke and the damp earth, and it created a strange, comforting perfume that seemed to belong to the night, to the frost, to the quiet, hidden world of the greenhouse. Martha Green held her cup in both hands, warming her fingers, and she looked at Arthur with those pale, clear eyes that seemed to see into him, to see the grief that he carried, the loneliness, the long, sleepless nights. "You have lost someone," she said, her voice a statement, not a question. "I can see it in your eyes. You have lost someone, and you have not yet found a way to let them go." Arthur looked down at his own cup, the dark liquid swirling in the lamplight. "My wife," he said. "Eleanor, she died 3 years ago. Pneumonia. It took her quickly, in the spring. just as the garden was beginning to come to life. She had been looking forward to the summer, to the roses, to the lavender, to the bees. She loved the bees. Martha Green nodded, her gaze steady. "I know what it is to lose a husband," she said. Samuel died in the autumn, in 1878. He had been working in the greenhouse, as he always did, and he had been feeling unwell, a pain in his chest, a shortness of breath. He did not tell me. He did not want to worry me. He went to the greenhouse, and he stoked the boiler, and he checked the plants, and he fell, and he died, and I found him, an hour later, lying on the gravel path, with the geraniums in bloom all around him. Arthur felt a cold chill run down his spine. The image was so vivid, so familiar, that it might have been his own future, his own end, lying on the gravel path, with the plants he had tended all his life as his only witnesses. "I am sorry," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I am so sorry." Martha Green shook her head. "It is a long time ago," she said. "I have made my peace with it, but I have not made my peace with the greenhouse. I have not been able to return. Until tonight, I knew that I had to come back, to see it one last time, to say goodbye to Samuel, to the place where we were happy, to the plants that he loved." She sipped her tea, and she looked around the greenhouse, her gaze moving slowly, taking in the details, the cracks in the glass, the rust on the pipes, the new growth on the cuttings. "You have kept it well," she said. "The greenhouse is in good hands. Samuel would be pleased. He would be proud of you." Arthur felt a warmth spread through his chest, a feeling that he had not felt in a long time. It was a feeling of being seen, of being recognized, of being part of something larger than himself, a chain of care and attention that stretched back through the years, through the gardeners who had come before him, the gardeners who had loved this place, who had tended it, who had passed it on. "Thank you," he said. "That means more than you know." They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the hiss of the steam, the clank of the pipes, the soft, steady breathing of the boiler. The frost was thickening on the glass, and the moonlight was dimming, and the world outside was growing colder and darker. But inside the greenhouse, there was warmth, and there was light, and there was a connection that had been forged in the shared language of grief and love. "Tell me about Samuel," Arthur said, finally. "Tell me about the garden, about the way it was when you were here." Martha Green smiled, and she began to speak, her voice low and calm, like the sound of water moving over stones. She spoke of the garden as it had been in the 1870s, when the estate was at its height, when the family had entertained guests from London, from Paris, from Vienna, and the garden had been a showpiece, a place of beauty and wonder. She spoke of the roses, hundreds of them, in every color and every shape, filling the walled garden with a fragrance that could be smelled from a mile away. She spoke of the peaches, grown on the south-facing wall, trained into fans that were a marvel of horticultural precision. She spoke of the grapes, grown in the vinery, huge, sweet, black clusters that were the envy of every estate in the county. And she spoke of Samuel, of his hands, strong and gentle, that could coax life from the most barren soil, that could shape a tree into a work of art, that could heal a plant that was sick and dying. She spoke of his voice, low and calm, that he used to talk to the plants, to the soil, to the sky. She spoke of his love, deep and steady, that had been the anchor of her life, the thing that had held her together through the hard years, the lean years, the years of loss and grief. "I have been thinking about him," she said, her voice soft, almost a whisper. "I have been thinking about him every day, for 50 years, and I have realized that I have been holding on to him, that I have been carrying him with me, like a weight, like a burden, and that I have not been able to let him go." I have not been able to say goodbye." Arthur looked at her, and he saw his own reflection in her eyes, the same grief, the same loneliness, the same fear of letting go. "How do you say goodbye?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "How do you let go of someone you have loved for so long?" Martha Green set down her cup, and she reached out and took his hand, her fingers warm and dry, her grip gentle but firm. "You do not let go," she said. "You do not forget. You do not move on. You simply learn to carry them differently. You learn to carry them with love, not with grief. You learn to carry them with gratitude, not with sadness. You learn to carry them in the way that you live, in the way that you love, in the way that you tend the garden, in the way that you care for the plants, in the way that you pass on what you have learned." She released his hand, and she stood up, her joints creaking, her movements slow and deliberate. "I have to go now," she said. "I have to say goodbye to Samuel, and I have to say goodbye to the greenhouse, and I have to go back to Yorkshire, to my daughter, to my grandchildren, to the life that I have built without him." Arthur stood up too, his heart heavy, but also lighter, somehow, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders, a weight that he had not even known he was carrying. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you for coming. Thank you for telling me your story." Martha Green smiled, and she walked to the door of the greenhouse, and she opened it, and she stepped out into the frost-lit night, the cold air rushing in, sharp and clean. She turned back for a moment, and she looked at Arthur, her eyes shining in the lantern light. "Goodbye, Arthur Finch," she said. "Take care of the greenhouse, take care of the plants, and take care of yourself." And then she was gone, her footsteps crunching on the gravel, fading into the darkness, until the only sound was the hiss of the steam, the clank of the pipes, and the soft, steady breathing of the boiler. The clock struck 3, and Arthur was alone. He sat on the stool, his hands wrapped around the now empty cup, and he stared at the door, at the place where Martha Green had stood, at the frost that was already beginning to form on the glass, reclaiming the space that had been warmed by her presence. He felt a strange, hollow feeling in his chest, a mixture of loss and release, of sadness and hope. He had been given a gift, he knew, a gift of understanding, a gift of connection, a gift that had come from the past, from the ghost of a gardener who had loved this place, who had loved his wife, who had learned to carry her with love, not with grief. He stood up and he moved through the greenhouse, checking the plants, touching the leaves, feeling the warmth of the boiler. The temperature was holding steady at 45 degrees, and the fire was burning well, the flames a steady, orange glow behind the iron grate. He added another shovelful of coal, and he adjusted the damper, and he listened to the sounds of the greenhouse, the quiet, steady rhythm of the night. He walked to the cool house, and he opened the door, and he stepped inside, the cold air hitting him, sharp and clean. He moved to the corner, to the myrtle, and he touched its leaves, their surface cool and smooth under his fingers. He thought of Eleanor, of her smile, of her laugh, of the way she had looked at him, the way she had seen him, the way she had loved him. He thought of the words that Martha Green had spoken, about carrying love, not grief, about gratitude, not sadness. He did not know if he could do it. He did not know if he could learn to carry Eleanor differently, to let go of the weight of his grief, to hold her in his heart with love, with gratitude, with the memory of the joy they had shared. But he knew that he wanted to try. He knew that he wanted to find a way to live again, to feel again, to open himself to the world, to the garden, to the people who might come into his life, to the possibility of connection, of love, of hope. He stayed in the cool house for a long time, his hand resting on the myrtle, his mind drifting through the years, the memories, the moments of joy and sorrow, the long, slow passage of time. He thought of the first time he had seen Eleanor, at the flower show in Ipswich, in the summer of 1879. She had been standing by the rose display, her hair the color of honey, her eyes the color of the sky, and she had smiled at him, and he had felt the world shift, the ground beneath his feet changing, the future opening up before him, a path that he had not known he was walking. He thought of their wedding, a small, quiet ceremony in the village church, with the roses in bloom and the bees humming in the lavender. He thought of their first home, the cottage, with its low ceilings and its creaking floors, and its garden that was wild and overgrown, waiting for his hands to shape it, to tend it, to make it bloom. He thought of the years that followed, the years of work and love and laughter, the years of planting and harvesting and dreaming, the years of being together, of being complete. And he thought of the end, the spring of 1905, when the pneumonia had taken her, quickly, quietly, in the night, while the garden was beginning to stir, the first shoots of the daffodils pushing through the soil, the first buds of the roses beginning to swell. He had been with her, holding her hand, watching her breathe, her breath slowing, until it stopped, and the silence had filled the room, and the world had ended, and he had been left alone, in the garden, with the plants, with the memories, with the grief. He felt the tears on his face, warm and wet, and he did not wipe them away. He let them fall, let them wash over him, let them be a release, a letting go, a beginning. He stood in the cold, dark corner of the cool house, with his hand on the myrtle, and he wept for Eleanor, for the life they had shared, for the love that would never end, for the grief that was slowly, beginning to transform into something else, something lighter, something that could be carried with love. The clock struck 3:30, and Arthur wiped his eyes, and he took a deep breath, the cold air filling his lungs, sharp and clean and alive. He walked back to the stove house, and he sat down on the stool, and he looked at the fire, the flames dancing, the heat radiating, the warmth of the boiler seeping into his bones. He felt tired, deeply, profoundly tired, a tiredness that was not just physical, but emotional, spiritual, a tiredness that he had been carrying for 3 years, a tiredness that was finally beginning to ease. He closed his eyes, and he let the warmth of the boiler wash over him, and he felt the plants around him, their quiet, green presence, their steady, patient growth, their trust in the cycle of the seasons, in the turning of the earth, in the return of the light. He felt the frost on the glass, the cold outside, the darkness of the night, and he felt the shelter of the greenhouse, the warmth, the life, the love that had been poured into it, by Samuel, by Martha, by himself, by all the gardeners who had come before, all the gardeners who would come after. The clock struck 4, and the world outside was silent, and the frost was thick and white, and the stars were beginning to fade, and the dawn was still hours away, and Arthur Finch, the head gardener of Swanton Morley Hall, sat in the warmth of the greenhouse, and he closed his eyes, and he let himself drift into the darkness, into the quiet, into the deep, slow, peaceful breath of the night. Arthur remained on the stool for a long while after Martha Green had gone, the silence of the greenhouse settling around him like a blanket, thick and warm and familiar. The fire crackled softly in the boiler, and the pipes ticked and sighed as the steam moved through them, and the plants stood in their ranks, patient and still, their leaves catching the golden light of the lantern, their shadows stretching and swaying with the flicker of the flame. He thought about what Martha had said, about carrying love instead of grief, about gratitude instead of sadness. about the way that the past could be held in the heart, without weighing it down, without crushing it, without closing it off from the world. He had never thought of it that way. He had thought of grief as a duty, a tribute, a way of honoring Eleanor's memory by refusing to let go, by holding on to the pain, by keeping it close, as if letting it go would mean forgetting her, would mean betraying her, would mean losing her all over again. But Martha had shown him a different path, a path that did not require him to forget, but only to remember differently, to hold Eleanor in his heart with love, with the warmth of the years they had shared, with the joy of the life they had built, rather than with the cold, sharp edge of the loss. He stood up, and he walked to the window, and he looked out at the frost-lit garden, the white expanse of the lawn, the dark shapes of the trees, the silver glint of the moon on the frozen pond. The world was still and quiet and beautiful, and he felt a flicker of something, a small, tentative warmth, a feeling that he had not felt in a long time, a feeling that might have been hope. He did not trust it, not yet. He was afraid that if he reached for it, if he acknowledged it, it would slip away like the frost on the glass, melting at the touch of the sun, disappearing into nothing. He turned back to the plants, and he began to check them, one by one, his hands moving through the familiar motions, the routine that had carried him through the long, dark years of his grief. He touched the leaves of the camellia, their surface smooth and glossy, their edges curling slightly in the dry air of the greenhouse. He checked the soil of the azalea, its surface damp and cool, its roots spreading through the pot, searching for nutrients, for water, for the things that it needed to survive. He adjusted the stakes of the stephanotis, its stems twisting and climbing, reaching for the light, its white flowers closed for the night, waiting for the dawn. He thought about the plants, and about the way they grew, the way they adapted, the way they found a way to thrive, even in the most difficult conditions. He had seen a rosebush, once, growing out of a crack in a brick wall, its roots clinging to the mortar, its stems reaching for the sun, its flowers blooming in the summer, defiant and beautiful. He had seen a lavender plant, growing in a patch of gravel, its leaves silver and fragrant, its flowers purple and delicate, its roots finding a way to survive, to flourish, to fill the air with its scent. He had seen so many plants in so many places that had found a way to live, to grow, to bloom, against all odds. And he had never thought to apply that lesson to himself. He had never thought that he, too, could find a way to grow, to adapt, to thrive, in the face of his loss. He had been so focused on the pain, on the absence, on the wound that had been carved into his heart, that he had forgotten that the heart, like the garden, could heal, could regenerate, could find a way to open itself to the light, to the warmth, to the possibility of new life. The clock struck 4:30, and the night was beginning to deepen, the darkness reaching its peak, the frost growing thicker and thicker on the glass, the cold pressing in from all sides. Arthur added another shovelful of coal to the boiler, and he adjusted the damper, and he listened to the sound of the fire, the steady, hungry roar of the flames, the hiss of the steam, the clank of the pipes. The greenhouse was a living thing, he thought, a creature of glass and iron and heat, breathing in the cold and breathing out warmth, sheltering the plants, sheltering him, sheltering the memory of all the gardeners who had tended it, who had loved it, who had poured their lives into its soil. He sat down on the stool, and he picked up the cup that Martha had left behind, its surface cool and dry, and he held it in his hands, feeling the weight of it, the shape of it, the smoothness of the glaze. He thought of her, of the life she had lived, of the love she had carried, of the way she had learned to let go, not by forgetting, but by remembering with gratitude. He thought of Samuel, the gardener who had built this greenhouse, who had loved this place, who had loved Martha, who had died of the fever, leaving her alone, leaving her with the grief, leaving her with the garden. And he thought of Eleanor, of her face, of her voice, of the way she had laughed, the way she had looked at him, the way she had seen him, not as the head gardener, not as the man who tended the plants, but as the man she loved, the man she had chosen, the man she had built a life with. He felt the tears on his face again, but they were different now, softer, warmer, less like a wound, and more like a release. He was not crying for the loss, he realized. He was crying for the love. He was crying for the years they had shared, the joy, the laughter, the quiet moments of connection, the small, ordinary miracles of a life lived together. He set down the cup, and he stood up, and he walked to the cool house, and he opened the door, and he stepped inside, the cold air hitting him, sharp and clean. He moved to the corner, to the myrtle, and he touched its leaves, their surface cool and smooth under his fingers. He thought of the day he had planted it, in the spring of 1905, just a few weeks after Eleanor had died. He had been numb, hollow, moving through the motions of his work without feeling, without purpose, without hope. He had planted the myrtle because it was what he did, because it was his job, because he did not know what else to do. But now, standing in the cold, dark corner of the cool house, with his hand on the myrtle, he felt a shift, a subtle change, a beginning. He felt the weight of his grief, the heavy, crushing weight that he had been carrying for 3 years, and he felt it begin to lift, just slightly, just enough to let him breathe. He did not know how to let go, not yet. He did not know how to carry Eleanor with love, not with grief, but he knew that he wanted to try. He knew that he wanted to find a way, to learn, to grow, to adapt, like the plants that he tended, like the rose bush in the crack of the wall, like the lavender in the gravel. He stayed in the cool house for a long time, his hand resting on the myrtle, his mind drifting through the memories, the moments of joy and sorrow, the long, slow passage of time. He thought of the years that had passed, the years of work and solitude, the years of tending the garden, of caring for the plants, of watching the seasons turn, of waiting for the pain to ease. And he felt, for the first time, a sense of peace, a quiet acceptance, a recognition that the pain would never fully go away, but that it did not have to define him, that it did not have to close him off from the world, that he could carry it and still live, still love, still hope. The clock struck 5, and the night was beginning to turn, the darkness softening, the first hint of gray appearing in the east, the frost on the glass beginning to glow, catching the light of the approaching dawn. Arthur walked back to the stove house, and he sat down on the stool, and he looked at the fire, the flames dancing, the heat radiating, the warmth of the boiler seeping into his bones. He felt tired, deeply, profoundly tired, but it was a good tired, a tiredness that came from release, from letting go, from the long, slow work of healing. He closed his eyes, and he let the warmth of the boiler wash over him, and he felt the plants around him, their quiet, green presence, their steady, patient growth, their trust in the cycle of the seasons, in the turning of the earth, in the return of the light. He felt the frost on the glass, the cold outside, the darkness of the night, and he felt the shelter of the greenhouse, the warmth, the life, the love that had been poured into it, by Samuel, by Martha, by himself, by all the gardeners who had come before, all the gardeners who would come after. And he thought of Eleanor, not with the sharp, cold edge of grief, but with the warmth of memory, with the gratitude for the years they had shared, with the love that would never end, that would never fade, that would always be a part of him, carried in his heart, not as a weight, but as a light. The clock struck 5:30, and Arthur rose from the stool, his joints stiff, his muscles aching from the long hours of sitting and standing and tending. He stretched his arms above his head, feeling the pull in his shoulders, the release of tension, the slow return of circulation to his limbs. The fire in the boiler was burning steadily, the flames a deep, steady orange, the heat radiating through the pipes, keeping the greenhouse at a constant, gentle warmth. He added a small shovelful of coal, more out of habit than necessity, and he adjusted the damper, and he listened to the sound of the fire, the quiet, steady murmur of the flames. He walked through the stove house, past the camellias, and the azaleas, and the stephanotis, their leaves brushing against his sleeves, their scent filling the air, a mixture of damp earth and green growth, and the faint, sweet perfume of the flowers that were beginning to open, responding to the warmth, responding to the light that would soon come. He pushed open the door to the propagation house, and he stepped inside, the air warm and humid, the smell of soil and peat and rooting cuttings rising around him, thick and fertile and alive. The propagation house was a smaller room, attached to the main greenhouse, its windows facing south, its benches filled with trays of cuttings, with pots of seedlings, with the beginnings of new life. Arthur had always loved this room, loved the sense of possibility, the promise of growth, the quiet, patient work of coaxing a new plant from a cutting, from a seed, from a tiny, fragile beginning. It was a room of hope, a room of faith, a room where the gardener's hands worked with the future, with the unseen, with the potential that lay dormant in the soil, waiting for the warmth, the moisture, the light. He moved to the first bench where a tray of rose cuttings stood, their stems tucked into pots of sandy soil, their leaves small and green, their roots beginning to form, to reach, to anchor themselves in the new earth. He touched one of the leaves, its surface soft and tender, its edge curling slightly, testing the air. He had taken these cuttings from the old rose garden, from the bushes that Eleanor had planted, the ones that had bloomed every summer, their flowers a deep, rich crimson, their scent heavy and sweet, filling the air with the memory of her. He had taken them in the autumn, after the flowers had faded, after the leaves had fallen, after the garden had gone to sleep for the winter. He had cut them with a sharp knife, at a precise angle, just below a node, and he had dipped them in the rooting powder, and he had tucked them into the sandy soil, and he had watered them, and he had waited. He had waited for the roots to form, for the new growth to appear, for the small, fragile cuttings to become plants, to become bushes, to become a new garden, a garden that would bloom in the summers to come, a garden that would carry Eleanor's legacy, her love, her memory, into the future. He had not thought of it that way before. He had taken the cuttings because it was what he did, because it was his job, because he could not bear to let the roses die, to let them be forgotten, to let them disappear into the past. But now, standing in the warm, humid air of the propagation house, with his hand on the small, green leaf, he understood. He had been carrying Eleanor, not just in his grief, but in his work, in his hands, in the plants that he tended, the roses that he propagated, the garden that he had built, and that he would continue to build, for as long as he lived. He moved to the next bench, where a tray of lavender cuttings stood, their stems silver and fragrant, their leaves soft and narrow, their roots already forming, already reaching, already anchoring themselves in the soil. He had taken these cuttings from the lavender hedge that bordered the kitchen garden, the hedge that Eleanor had loved, the hedge that she had trimmed and tended and cared for, her hands moving through the silver leaves, her face lit by the sun, her smile warm and open and full of joy. He remembered the way she had looked, standing in the garden, her hands covered in soil, her hair escaping from its pins, her eyes bright with the pleasure of the work. She had loved the garden, almost as much as he had, and she had understood it, in a way that few people did, understood the rhythms of the seasons, the needs of the plants, the patience that was required to coax life from the earth. She had been his partner, in the garden as in everything else, and he had missed her, not just in the quiet hours of the night, but in the work of the day, in the garden that they had built together, in the plants that they had tended, in the life that they had shared. He touched the lavender, its fragrance rising around him, filling his lungs, calming his mind. He thought of the words that Martha Green had spoken, about carrying love, not grief, about gratitude, not sadness. He thought of the lavender, and of the way that it grew, the way that it adapted, the way that it thrived, even in the most difficult conditions. He had seen lavender growing in the cracks of a stone wall, its roots clinging to the mortar, its leaves silver and fragrant, its flowers purple and delicate, its presence a testament to the resilience of life, the persistence of beauty, the power of hope. He moved through the propagation house, checking the trays, testing the soil, adjusting the vents, his hands moving through the familiar motions, his mind drifting through the memories. He came to a tray of hellebore seedlings, their leaves small and dark, their stems sturdy and strong, their roots already spreading through the soil, reaching for the nutrients that they needed to grow. He had planted these seeds in the autumn, from the hellebores that grew in the shade garden, the ones that bloomed in the winter, their flowers white and pink and deep, dark purple, their petals opening in the cold, defying the frost, bringing color to the gray, dormant days. He had always loved the hellebores, loved their stubbornness, their refusal to wait for the spring, their determination to bloom in the darkest, coldest months of the year. He had planted them in the shade garden, under the old oak tree, where the sun was scarce, and the soil was thin, and the competition for light was fierce. And they had thrived, year after year, their roots spreading, their flowers multiplying, their presence a reminder that life could persist, that beauty could bloom, even in the most difficult conditions. He thought of Eleanor, and of the way that she had loved the hellebores, the way that she had called them the winter roses, the way that she had cut them and brought them into the house, arranging them in a vase on the windowsill, their petals catching the pale winter light, their colors bright and warm in the cold, gray days. He thought of the last winter that she had been alive, the winter of 1904, when she had been sick, and he had brought her a hellebore, a single, white flower, and she had held it in her hands, her fingers pale and thin, her eyes bright with the pleasure of the gift. He felt the tears on his face again, but they were not tears of grief, not anymore. They were tears of gratitude, of love, of the deep, quiet joy of remembering. He stood in the propagation house, with the trays of cuttings and the pots of seedlings, and the warm, humid air around him, and he let the tears fall, and he let the memories wash over him, and he let himself feel the love that he had carried for Eleanor, the love that would never end, the love that was a part of him, a part of the garden, a part of the life that he had built, and that he would continue to build for as long as he lived. The clock struck 6, and the first light of dawn was beginning to appear in the east, a pale, gray glow that seeped through the frost on the glass, casting a soft, diffuse light over the plants, the benches, the trays of cuttings and seedlings. Arthur wiped his eyes, and he took a deep breath, the warm, humid air filling his lungs, and he felt a sense of peace, a quiet acceptance, a recognition that he was not alone, that he was connected to the past, to the future, to the garden, to the plants, to the love that had been poured into the soil, and that would continue to grow and bloom and spread for as long as the world turned. The clock had just struck 6:30 when Arthur heard the sound of footsteps on the gravel path outside, a slow, careful crunching that grew louder, closer, until it stopped at the door of the greenhouse. He looked up, expecting to see one of the undergardeners, perhaps Wilson, arriving early for the morning's work, or perhaps the cook, coming to fetch herbs for the kitchen. But when the door opened, it was Martha Green who stepped inside, her face flushed with the cold, her eyes bright, her coat buttoned to the chin, a small leather-bound book in her hands. Arthur rose from the stool, surprised and a little confused. "Martha," he said, "I thought you had gone." "I had," she said, her voice breathless, as if she had been hurrying. "But I remembered something I wanted to show you." She walked to the stove house, and she sat down on the stool, and she opened the leather-bound book, its pages yellowed and worn, its spine cracked, its cover soft and faded. She turned the pages carefully, her fingers gentle, her eyes scanning the words, the sketches, the notes that filled the margins. She found what she was looking for, and she held the book out to Arthur, her hand trembling slightly, her eyes bright with emotion. "This was Samuel's," she said. "His journal. He kept it for years, recording everything, the plants he grew, the experiments he tried, the successes and the failures. He wrote about the greenhouse, about the day he built it, about the day he first lit the boiler, about the day he planted the first camellia, the first azalea, the first stephanotis." Arthur took the book, his hands careful, his fingers brushing the worn leather, the yellowed pages. He opened it, and he saw the handwriting, small and neat. The ink faded to a pale brown, the letters formed with care and precision. He read the first entry, dated the 15th of March, 1885, the day that Samuel had begun to build the greenhouse, the day that he had laid the first brick, the day that he had begun to create the place that Arthur had come to love, the place that had become his home, his refuge, his sanctuary. "I have begun the work today," Samuel had written. "The ground is broken, the foundation is laid, and the first bricks are in place. The cold is bitter and the wind is sharp, but I feel the warmth of the work, the heat of the labor, the fire of the hope that burns in my heart. This greenhouse will be a place of life, a place of growth, a place of beauty. It will be a gift to Martha, a gift to the garden, a gift to the years that are to come." Arthur turned the pages, reading the entries, following the progress of the greenhouse, the building of the walls, the installation of the boiler, the laying of the pipes, the fitting of the glass. He read about the plants that Samuel had brought, the camellias from Cornwall, the azaleas from the nurseries of London, the stephanotis from the conservatories of the great houses, the plants that had been carried across the country, across the world, to find a home in this small, heated space, in this place of warmth and light and life. He read about the experiments that Samuel had conducted, the attempts to grow peaches and nectarines and grapes, the trials with different soils and fertilizers and watering regimes, the successes and the failures, the moments of triumph and the moments of despair. He read about the day that the first camellia had bloomed, a single white flower, its petals perfect and pure, its scent delicate and sweet, a triumph of patience and skill and love. And he read about the day that Samuel had met Martha, a young girl from the village who had come to the greenhouse to buy a cutting of rosemary, and who had stayed to talk, and who had returned, again and again, until she had become a part of the garden, a part of the greenhouse, a part of Samuel's life. The entries changed after that, becoming softer, more personal, filled with the details of their courtship, their marriage, their life together in the cottage by the garden wall. Arthur looked up from the book, his eyes meeting Martha's, his heart full of a strange, quiet emotion. "He loved you," he said. "He loved you very much." Martha nodded, her eyes shining with tears. "He did," she said, "and I loved him. I loved him with all my heart, and I have never stopped loving him. Not for a single day, not for a single moment. But I have learned to carry that love without the weight of the grief. without the sharpness of the loss. I have learned to remember him with gratitude, with joy, with the warmth of the years that we shared. She reached out and took the book from Arthur, her fingers brushing his, and she turned to the last page, the final entry, dated the 10th of December, 1894, the day before Samuel had died. She read it aloud, her voice soft and steady, the words falling into the quiet of the greenhouse like the first flakes of snow. My dearest Martha, the entry read, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and I am sorry, more sorry than I can say, for the pain that my leaving will cause you. But I want you to know that I have loved you, with every breath, with every beat of my heart, with every moment of my life. I want you to know that the greenhouse, the garden, the plants, the flowers, the trees, they are all a part of my love for you, a part of the life that we have built together, a part of the beauty that we have created, and that will continue to grow and to bloom and to spread for as long as the world turns. I want you to know that it is all right to let go. It is all right to move on. It is all right to find joy again, to find love again, to find a new life, a new path, a new way of being in the world. You do not have to carry me with you as a weight, as a burden, as a thing that holds you back. You can carry me in your heart, in the way that you remember the laughter, the joy, the love that we shared. You can carry me in the garden, in the plants that we tended, in the flowers that we grew, in the beauty that we created together. You can carry me in the way that you live, in the way that you love, in the way that you open yourself to the world, to the people, to the moments of grace and beauty and joy that are waiting for you in the years that are to come. I will always be with you, in the garden, in the greenhouse, in the heart of the plants that we loved. But I want you to be free. I want you to be happy. I want you to live. With all my love, Samuel. Martha closed the book, and she held it to her chest, and she closed her eyes, and she let the tears fall, silent and slow, her shoulders shaking with the release of a grief that had been carried for 50 years, a grief that was finally beginning to transform into something else, something lighter, something that could be carried with love. Arthur watched her, and he felt the weight of his own grief, the weight that he had carried for 3 years, and he felt it begin to lift, just slightly, just enough to let him breathe. He reached out, and he took her hand, his fingers warm and steady, and he held it, and he said nothing, because there was nothing to say, nothing but the quiet, steady presence of two people, bound by loss, bound by love, bound by the garden and the greenhouse, and the life that had been poured into the soil. The clock struck 7, and the gray light of dawn was beginning to fill the greenhouse, the frost on the glass catching the pale, diffuse glow, the plants emerging from the shadows, their leaves and stems and flowers taking on color and form, becoming visible, becoming real. Arthur released Martha's hand, and he stood up, his legs stiff, his back aching, and he walked to the window, and he looked out at the garden, the white expanse of the lawn, the dark shapes of the trees, the silver glint of the pond, the first hints of color appearing in the east, a pale, rosy glow that promised the coming of the sun. He felt different. He could not say exactly how or why, but he felt different. The weight of his grief, the heavy, crushing weight that he had carried for 3 years, had lifted, not completely, but enough to let him breathe, enough to let him see the world around him, the garden, the greenhouse, the plants, the woman who sat on the stool, her face wet with tears, her hands holding the leather-bound book, her heart full of the love that she had carried for 50 years. He turned back to her, and he saw her smile, a small, tentative smile, a smile that was full of hope, full of possibility, full of the promise of a new beginning. She stood up, and she walked to him, and she took his hand, her fingers warm and dry, her grip gentle but firm. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. Thank you for helping me to remember, to let go, to find a way to carry Samuel with love, not with grief. Arthur shook his head. It was you who helped me, he said. You who showed me that it was possible. You who showed me that I could carry Eleanor with love, not with grief. That I could remember her with gratitude, not with sadness. That I could open myself to the world, to the garden, to the people who might come into my life, to the possibility of connection, of love, of hope. Martha smiled, and she squeezed his hand, and she released it, and she walked to the door of the greenhouse, and she opened it, and she stepped out into the frost-lit morning, the cold air rushing in, sharp and clean, the first rays of the sun appearing over the horizon, casting a pale, golden light over the garden, the greenhouse, the frost on the grass, the frost on the trees, the frost on the glass. She turned back for a moment, and she looked at him, her eyes shining in the light of the dawn. "Goodbye, Arthur Finch," she said. "Take care of the greenhouse, take care of the plants, and take care of yourself." And then she was gone, her footsteps crunching on the gravel, fading into the distance, until the only sound was the hiss of the steam, the clank of the pipes, and the soft, steady breathing of the boiler. Arthur stood at the door, watching her go, the cold air filling his lungs, the light of the dawn warming his face. He felt a strange, quiet peace, a sense of release, a sense of letting go, a sense of opening himself to the world, to the garden, to the life that was waiting for him in the years that were to come. He walked back to the stove house, and he sat down on the stool, and he looked at the fire, the flames dancing, the heat radiating, the warmth of the boiler seeping into his bones. He closed his eyes, and he let the warmth wash over him, and he felt the plants around him, their quiet, green presence, their steady, patient growth, their trust in the cycle of the seasons, in the turning of the earth, in the return of the light. And he felt himself begin to let go. It was not a sudden thing, not a dramatic release, but a slow, gradual process, like the melting of the frost on the glass, like the opening of the flowers in the morning, like the first, tentative shoots of the hellebores pushing through the frozen soil. He felt the tension in his shoulders begin to ease, the tightness in his chest begin to loosen, the weight of his grief begin to lift, not completely, but enough to let him breathe, enough to let him feel, enough to let him hope. He thought of Eleanor, and he saw her face, not with the sharp, cold edge of grief, but with the warmth of memory, with the gratitude for the years they had shared, with the love that would never end, that would never fade, that would always be a part of him, carried in his heart, not as a weight, but as a light. He thought of the garden, and he saw the roses, the lavender, the hellebores, the myrtle, the plants that he had tended, the plants that he had propagated, the plants that would continue to grow and bloom and spread for as long as the world turned. He thought of the future, and he saw the years ahead, the seasons turning, the plants growing, the garden changing, the life that he would build, not in the shadow of his grief, but in the light of his love. He did not know what the future would bring, did not know if he would find love again, or joy, or connection, but he knew that he was ready to open himself to the possibility, ready to let go of the past, ready to embrace the present, ready to step into the unknown, with hope, with courage, with the quiet, steady faith of the gardener, who trusts that the seeds will grow, that the flowers will bloom, that the garden will flourish, in its own time, in its own way. The clock struck 7:30, and the sun was rising, the frost on the glass beginning to melt, the plants emerging from the shadows, their leaves and stems and flowers catching the light, their colors bright and warm in the new day. Arthur opened his eyes, and he looked at the fire, the flames dancing, the heat radiating, the warmth of the boiler seeping into his bones. He felt tired, deeply, profoundly tired. but it was a good tired, a tiredness that came from release, from letting go, from the long, slow work of healing. He stood up, and he walked to the door of the greenhouse, and he opened it, and he stepped out into the garden, the cold air sharp and clean, the light of the sun warm on his face. He looked at the frost on the grass, the frost on the trees, the frost on the pond, and he saw the beauty of it, the quiet, crystalline beauty of the winter morning, the promise of the day that was waiting, the promise of the life that was waiting for him in the years that were to come. And he felt, for the first time in 3 years, a sense of peace, a quiet acceptance, a recognition that he was not alone, that he was connected to the past, to the future, to the garden, to the plants, to the love that had been poured into the soil and that would continue to grow and bloom and spread for as long as the world turned. The clock struck 8, and Arthur returned to the greenhouse, the cold air clinging to his coat, the frost on his boots melting in the warmth of the stovehouse. He closed the door behind him, shutting out the garden, the dawn, the world, and he stood in the quiet, warm space, the hiss of the steam, the clank of the pipes, the soft, steady breathing of the boiler, filling the air around him. The plants stood in their ranks, patient and still, their leaves turning towards the light, their colors deepening in the warmth of the morning. He sat down on the stool, and he leaned back against the wall, and he closed his eyes. The exhaustion that he had been holding at bay, the exhaustion that had been building for 3 years, for the long, dark years of his grief, for the long, sleepless nights of his vigil, began to wash over him, a wave of tiredness, of weariness, of the deep, profound need for rest. He felt his muscles begin to soften, his shoulders begin to drop, his breathing begin to slow, the rhythm of his lungs matching the rhythm of the boiler, the steady, patient pulse of the greenhouse. Sleep came. It did not ask permission. It did not announce itself. It simply arrived, like the tide, like the turning of the season, like the first frost of the winter, settling over the garden, covering the world in a soft white blanket, muffling the sounds, softening the edges, bringing a quiet, deep, profound peace. Arthur felt himself sinking, not into a darkness, but into a warmth, a soft, enveloping warmth, like the heat of the boiler, like the warmth of the sun on a summer afternoon, like the embrace of a loved one after a long, long absence. He drifted, his mind floating, his thoughts scattering, like the leaves of the autumn, falling, settling, becoming still. He saw Eleanor, her face, her smile, her eyes, the way she had looked at him, the way she had seen him, the way she had loved him. He saw the garden, the roses, the lavender, the hellebores, the myrtle, the plants that he had tended, the plants that he had propagated, the plants that would continue to grow and bloom and spread for as long as the world turned. He saw the greenhouse, the glass, the iron, the pipes, the boiler, the fire, the light, the warmth, the life that had been poured into it by Samuel, by Martha, by himself, by all the gardeners who had come before, all the gardeners who would come after. He saw the frost on the glass, the cold outside, the darkness of the night, and he felt the shelter of the greenhouse, the warmth, the love, the peace that had been built into it, brick by brick, pipe by pipe, plant by plant, over the years, over the decades, over the long, slow passage of time. He felt the weight of his grief, the heavy, crushing weight that he had carried for 3 years, and he felt it lift, rise, dissolve, like the frost on the glass, melting in the warmth of the morning, disappearing into the air, becoming nothing. He felt the love that he had carried for Eleanor, the love that had been buried under the weight of his grief, the love that had been hidden, forgotten, waiting to be rediscovered, and he felt it rise, expand, fill the space that had been emptied by the loss, fill his heart, fill his mind, fill the greenhouse, fill the garden, fill the world. He was not dreaming, he was not awake. He was in a place between, a place of warmth and quiet and peace, a place where the past and the present and the future were one, a place where the garden and the greenhouse and the plants were alive and growing and blooming in the light of the love that had been poured into them by all the hands that had tended them, by all the hearts that had cared for them, by all the lives that had been lived in their presence. He felt the plants around him, their quiet, green presence, their steady, patient growth, their trust in the cycle of the seasons, in the turning of the earth, in the return of the light. He felt the warmth of the boiler, the heat of the fire, the pulse of the steam, the rhythm of the pipes, the heartbeat of the greenhouse, the heartbeat of the garden, the heartbeat of the world. And he felt himself let go, completely, entirely, without reservation, without fear, without regret. He let go of the grief, the pain, the loss, the loneliness, the years of solitude, the years of waiting, the years of holding on. He let go of the past, the memories, the moments of joy and sorrow, the long, slow passage of time. He let go of the future, the uncertainty, the fear, the hope, the possibility of love, of connection, of new life. He let go of everything, and he sank into the warmth, into the quiet, into the deep, slow, peaceful breath of the night. The clock struck 8:30, and the world outside was still, and the frost was beginning to melt, and the sun was rising, and the plants were opening, and the greenhouse was warm, and Arthur Finch, the head gardener of Swanton Morley Hall, was asleep. The hours passed, and the sun climbed higher in the sky, its light streaming through the glass of the greenhouse, casting long, golden shadows across the plants, the benches, the trays of cuttings and seedlings. The frost on the glass melted, the water running down the panes in thin, silver rivulets, catching the light, sparkling like diamonds, falling to the earth, to the soil, to the roots of the plants, feeding them, nourishing them, giving them the water that they needed to grow. Arthur did not stir. He sat on the stool, his back against the wall, his head resting on his chest, his hands loose in his lap, his breathing slow and steady and deep. The fire in the boiler burned low, the flames a soft, steady orange, the heat radiating through the pipes, keeping the greenhouse at a constant, gentle warmth. The plants stood in their ranks, patient and still, their leaves turning towards the light, their colors deepening in the warmth of the morning, their roots reaching, spreading, anchoring themselves in the soil. He slept, and in his sleep, he dreamed. He dreamed of the garden that he had tended, the garden that he had loved, the garden that had been his life, his refuge, his sanctuary. He dreamed of the roses, the crimson roses that Eleanor had planted, the roses that bloomed every summer, their scent heavy and sweet, filling the air with the memory of her. He dreamed of the lavender, the silver hedge that bordered the kitchen garden, the hedge that Eleanor had trimmed and tended and cared for, her hands moving through the leaves, her face lit by the sun, her smile warm and open and full of joy. He dreamed of the hellebores, the winter roses that bloomed in the cold, their petals white and pink and deep, dark purple, their colors bright and warm in the gray, dormant days. He dreamed of the myrtle, the plant that he had planted in the spring of 1905, the plant that had grown and spread and flourished in the cool, dark corner of the greenhouse, its leaves glossy and green, its flowers small and white and fragrant, its presence a testament to the resilience of life, the persistence of beauty, the power of hope. He dreamed of the greenhouse, the glass, the iron, the pipes, the boiler, the fire, the light, the warmth, the life that had been poured into it, by Samuel, by Martha, by himself, by all the gardeners who had come before, all the gardeners who would come after. He dreamed of the frost on the glass, the cold outside, the darkness of the night, and he felt the shelter of the greenhouse, the warmth, the love, the peace that had been built into it, brick by brick, pipe by pipe, plant by plant, over the years, over the decades, over the long, slow passage of time. He dreamed of Eleanor, and he saw her face, not with the sharp, cold edge of grief, but with the warmth of memory, with the gratitude for the years they had shared, with the love that would never end, that would never fade, that would always be a part of him, carried in his heart, not as a weight, but as a light. He dreamed of the years they had spent together, the years of work and love and laughter, the years of planting and harvesting and dreaming, the years of being together, of being complete. He dreamed of the end, the spring of 1905, when the pneumonia had taken her, quickly, quietly in the night, while the garden was beginning to stir, the first shoots of the daffodils pushing through the soil, the first buds of the roses beginning to swell. He dreamed of the moment that she had died, the moment that her breath had stopped, the moment that the silence had filled the room, the moment that the world had ended, and he had been left alone, in the garden, with the plants, with the memories, with the grief. But the dream was different now. The grief was not sharp, not cold, not crushing. It was soft, warm, like the light of the morning, like the heat of the fire, like the embrace of the greenhouse. He dreamed of Eleanor, and he felt her presence, not as an absence, not as a loss, but as a presence, a warmth, a light, a love that was still with him, that would always be with him, that would never leave him, not for a single day, not for a single moment, not for a single breath. He slept, and the hours passed, and the sun climbed higher, and the frost melted, and the plants opened, and the greenhouse was warm, and Arthur Finch, the head gardener of Swanton Morley Hall, was at peace. The clock struck 11, and the world outside was bright, and the garden was waking, and the birds were singing, and the frost was gone, and the day was beginning, and Arthur Finch, the head gardener of Swanton Morley Hall, opened his eyes. The light was bright, streaming through the glass of the greenhouse, casting long, golden shadows across the plants, the benches, the trays of cuttings and seedlings. The air was warm, and the smell of the earth, the green, the growing things, was thick and rich and alive. The fire in the boiler was burning low, the flames a soft, steady orange, the heat radiating through the pipes, keeping the greenhouse at a constant, gentle warmth. Arthur blinked, his eyes adjusting to the light, his mind slowly emerging from the depths of the sleep, the dream, the long, quiet hours of rest. He felt a sense of disorientation, a sense of not knowing where he was, or when, or how long he had been asleep. But then he saw the plants, the camellias, the azaleas, the stephanotis, the myrtle, and he remembered. He remembered the greenhouse, the garden, the night, the frost, the woman who had come, the story that she had told, the words that she had spoken, the gift that she had given him. He remembered the dream of Eleanor, the dream of the garden, the dream of the love that had been poured into the soil and that would continue to grow and bloom and spread for as long as the world turned. He remembered the release, the letting go, the deep, quiet peace that had settled over him as he had slept, as he had rested, as he had healed. He stood up, his joints stiff, his muscles aching, but the ache was a good ache, the ache of a body that had rested, that had recovered, that was ready to begin again. He stretched his arms above his head, feeling the pull in his shoulders, the release of tension, the slow return of circulation to his limbs. He walked to the boiler, and he added a shovelful of coal, and he adjusted the damper, and he listened to the sound of the fire, the quiet, steady murmur of the flames. He walked through the greenhouse, checking the plants, touching the leaves, feeling the soil, testing the temperature. The camellias were blooming, their flowers a deep, rich pink, their petals soft and velvety, their scent delicate and sweet. The azaleas were covered in buds, their colors beginning to show, a promise of the beauty that was to come. The stephanotis was climbing, its stems twisting and reaching, its white flowers open, filling the air with their fragrance. He walked to the cool house, and he opened the door, and he stepped inside, the cold air sharp and clean, a welcome contrast to the warmth of the stove house. He moved to the corner, to the myrtle, and he touched its leaves, their surface cool and smooth under his fingers. The plant was healthy, its leaves glossy and green, its roots spreading through the pot, its presence a testament to the care that he had given it, the love that he had poured into it, the hope that he had planted in its soil. He thought of Eleanor, and he felt the warmth of her memory, the gratitude for the years they had shared, the love that would never end, that would never fade, that would always be a part of him, carried in his heart, not as a weight, but as a light. He thought of the garden, and he saw the roses, the lavender, the hellebores, the myrtle, the plants that he had tended, the plants that he had propagated, the plants that would continue to grow and bloom and spread for as long as the world turned. He walked to the door of the greenhouse, and he opened it, and he stepped out into the garden, the light of the morning warm on his face, the air fresh and clean, the birds singing in the trees, the frost gone, the world alive and awake and full of the promise of the day. He stood in the garden, the greenhouse behind him, the plants around him, the sky above him, and he felt a sense of peace, a quiet acceptance, a recognition that he was not alone, that he was connected to the past, to the future, to the garden, to the plants, to the love that had been poured into the soil, and that would continue to grow and bloom and spread for as long as the world turned. And he thought of the night that had passed, the frost, the fire, the woman, the story, the dream, the sleep. He thought of the words that Martha Green had spoken, about carrying love, not grief, about gratitude, not sadness. He thought of the words that Samuel had written in his journal, about letting go, about moving on, about finding joy again, about finding love again, about finding a new life, a new path, a new way of being in the world. And he thought of the greenhouse, the glass, the iron, the pipes, the boiler, the fire, the light, the warmth, the life that had been poured into it, by Samuel, by Martha, by himself, by all the gardeners who had come before, all the gardeners who would come after. He thought of the plants, the camellias, the azaleas, the stephanotis, the myrtle, the roses, the lavender, the hellebores, the plants that he had tended, the plants that he had propagated, the plants that would continue to grow and bloom and spread for as long as the world turned. He stood in the garden, the light of the morning warm on his face, the air fresh and clean, the birds singing in the trees, and he felt the frost of the night melting, the grief of the years lifting, the love of the past blooming, in the quiet, steady, patient heart of the gardener, who trusts that the seeds will grow, that the flowers will bloom, that the garden will flourish, in its own time, in its own way. Arthur Finch, the head gardener of Swanton Morley Hall, turned back to the greenhouse, and he walked inside, and he closed the door behind him, and he began the work of the day.